Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming to this June 15th beautiful day for the Practical Knowledge Series. Welcome to everybody in the room and to everybody else online as well. I think we had 20 people registered for here and 30 people online, so we probably have very good attendance in combination today. Today we'll be talking about the topic of startup or license of your technology and all the different attributes and topics that go along with that. And I already heard some war stories being told, so I think it'll be a fun day. My name is Kevin Harter, and I'll introduce our panelists, and they'll introduce themselves further in just a second. Just by way of background, I'm a professor of practice in entrepreneurship at Penn State College of Medicine, and I'm in the departments of pharmacology and surgery there, and I direct the Center for medical innovation at Hershey as my day job as well. So Michelle and I have gone back a decade together in the world of funding from the life science greenhouse world. So my role is really as the entrepreneur as well as the funder of companies like this. And we have people from a dynamic area right now. Before we get started, I wanted to talk about our sponsors, Riverside Law. Anybody here from Riverside? I didn't see anybody that I recognize. And also MVM Associates. Nope, strike two. Okay, well, we thank them for their contributions to this effort and the series overall. And our panelists today, Heather Rose, on my right, Director of Technology Licensing here at Thomas Jefferson University. Kate Rigaut, did I get it right? Mm-hmm. Terrific. Intellectual Property Law at Dann-Dorfman, Herrell-Skillman. Okay. Sounds like a law firm.
It is.
It is a law firm.
Forgive me.
And Michelle Washko, President of Life Science Innovations and a former colleague of mine. So this is meant to be somewhat informal. Do we have a way of getting questions to us from the online?
Dan?
They can tweet at us. Yeah, we can post that.
What's
Okay.
the tweet?
At Jefferson, at Jeff Innovation.
Okay, and for those of you that have questions online, at Jeff Innovations or Innovation? Innovation, no S. You can tweet to us questions online as we go through as well. Terrific. So let me start with Heather to introduce yourself a little bit further and what you do here at Jefferson, and also a little bit about the early disclosure process and where you get started with technologies here.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kevin. So my name's Heather Rose. I'm the Director of Technology Licensing for the Innovation Pillar. So what our arm of innovation does is manage the patents that the university has rights to through our agreements for employment in regards to basically the cradle to grave process of getting disclosures from our inventors and then making decisions about when the right time to file a patent is, or if a patent is, if it's ever going to be time for a patent or there's some other kind of IP we might want to put in place for protection. And then concomitant with that, thinking from the inception of getting that disclosure about who the potential end users are of that or end benefitees of that technology, and what we need to do to get it to the people who need it. So I very much do focus the way that we manage our technologies based on the fact that we're an academic nonprofit institution, and it doesn't matter what we do here if it doesn't get to the people who need it. So focusing on the meaningful translation of our technologies to the market, which usually takes, there's a million different routes that can take depending on the technology, what kind of regulatory approval it may or may not need, what kind of IP we may or may not need, et cetera. So that's the quick overview. I'm sure we'll get more into it later.
Well, I'm going to already start my ad-libbing here. So you talked about people who need it. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Why is that important?
Yeah. So, I mean, in one sense, I would say patience, but I think that's far, in one way, sometimes too broad and other times, sometimes too narrow. But I mean, also, I think that patience is such an odd word because we're all patients. tomorrow if we get sick, right? I mean, the concept of patients as different kind of people than us has really never resonated with me. So basically what I mean is that I don't want our technology to end here. I want it to become something that helps the public, and usually that means there's going to have to be some translational efforts, funding, further development, regulatory approval, and an appropriate partner for taking it to market. Most of that stuff will happen outside of the walls of the university.
Great, thank you. So Kate, can you tell us a little bit more about, from your side, your view of intellectual property and its progression, and of course about yourself as well?
Hi, I'm Kate Rigaut. I'm a patent attorney at Dann-Dorfman, Herrell-Skillman. I got to Dann-Dorfman by way of the NIH. I was a staff fellow down there, and my senior partner met my brother-in-law and said, these lawyers don't know how to write any patents on these genes coming out of Fox Chase. Do you know anyone? And he said, oh, you must meet my sister-in-law. She knows all about that. So I'm an accidental attorney. I was a scientist until I was 35, and then I went to law school at night, worked for Dann-Dorfman, and the first patent I wrote was out of Fox Chase, and it was about a very important cancer gene called HEF1, and another gene made in celery that recognized all mutations between two DNA strands. So the first summer I thought, wow. When I took the job at the patent law, I thought, well, I have 3 papers in the pipeline, and so if this doesn't work out, I'll be able to go back to science. But I have to say, the best thing about being a biotechnology patent attorney is that they only call you with the eureka moment. As you know, we all struggled I struggled at the bench, and I did get publications, but there was always the fear that you're only as good as your last great idea, and you always have to keep producing. And so for me, the practice of patent law has been fascinating and very exciting, and we've been involved in bringing very important therapeutics to the marketplace, and I've seen it from birth. I've seen it from birth to success and from birth to death, and we're going to be talking about that today. But I focus my work on university practice. And so what I do see the very, very early stages where there may not be a whole lot of money, and what are we going to do when we do believe we're having that eureka moment to make that product that will benefit mankind generally. So what we're going to talk about is, so when we get to that point where someone's come to the office with something that looks very promising, there's many things we have to figure out, as Heather alluded to. How are we going to pay for this? Even to just file a patent in the Big Five, what you need to know is very expensive. Typically, my university clients will go to the United States, Australia, Canada, Europe, and Japan. Just to file in those countries is going to run you about $60,000, and that's just to file. You haven't paid for my preparation of that patent, and that might be another 6 to 10, depending on the subject matter. And you've just entered these countries. To fully get those 5 countries, a patent in those 5 countries is going to run between $500,000 to $1 million, depending on whether or not the prosecution is difficult. So the point I'm trying to make is, this is not an inexpensive endeavor, and you don't go forward unless you believe you're going to make a profit because of the initial outlay of expense that must be done. So on that note, as we progress through the conversation, we'll see, okay, we have our idea. What do we do next? And that's what we'll be talking about today.
I'm just curious, from both of you that have made comments, do you frequently see people show up with ideas that you unfortunately have to come back to them and tell them that, well, there's been 1 or 2 or 3 or 15 other people that have covered that space already, and sorry?
It's definitely, some variation of that definitely has happened, sure. But our researchers are quite premier in their fields. Usually it's their area of scholarship, and they know who else is out there and what they're doing. What I find happens, though, is there ends up being, I think, a little bit of a fuzzy area between the difference between what somebody might need to get a peer review publication out and what can compromise patentability, and the bar is much lower for patentability prevention, something that would impede getting a patent, unfortunately. And so I wouldn't say that I need to usually point out to people like, oh, well, so-and-so and so-and-so did this exact same thing first, and we're just going to have an anticipation issue. But to say, like, unfortunately, the combination of your publications kind of leads, that's a very tough discussion to have, and that's one of the hardest parts, I think, about being a nonprofit whose mission is partially to make sure that we publish our work and advance science in that way. So I call it catching the light bulbs before they hit the ground to make sure that we get as good a patent as possible, while in combination making sure that we don't impede people publishing and keeping with our other mission of making sure that we get our science out there literally. And I'm sure that you have additional.
Well, I was on the phone this morning with a client from another university looking at an invention disclosure, and I said, "Oh, client, we do have a problem here." And this is typically what they do. If they are going to say, "We really can't go forward because the prior art is too dark and deep," they always make me tell them, okay? So that good relations between your office and the inventor remain stable. Because, and sometimes it happens. This gentleman is very keen to have a startup on this technology, and I went on, and it has to do with a way to propagate duckweed, okay, very fascinating. And I went on Pinterest, and I saw essentially his system. And so Pinterest, all right, if it's on Pinterest, we really can't go forward. And so then you have to be the bearer of bad news, shoot the messenger. So I will write up a little report. This is the prior art I found. And unless we have some other wrinkle or some bell or whistle I have failed to appreciate, I don't think we can go forward. But that doesn't mean you can't bring that product to market. That's one thing everybody has to appreciate here. There are many things out there for sale. Let's all recall the topsy tail, that bent hanger that woman sold to make a ponytail. That didn't have patent protection, and she made millions. So just because you can't get a patent doesn't mean the party's over.
I will balance that though with in the field where we play frequently, there's a huge lift to get something to market in regards to regulatory approval investment. And there, if you don't have a patent or some other way to recoup that investment by exclusivity, maybe by like orphan approval, et cetera, maybe, if we were producing products for ponytails, it might, it might be easier, but we don't have a lot of those.
Right.
We don't not have any, but.
I always have the goal of having one takeaway come from any meeting, and I already have throw the lawyer under the bus. So that's a very useful one for today. Thank you.
I'm here for you.
Thank you. So, Michelle, you've worked in big pharma, and you've worked with some crazy partners at Life Science Greenhouse. So what's your view of all this topic about startup versus license?
Sure. So a little bit about myself. I'm Michelle Washko. I spent about 20 years in the healthcare innovation space. So that included some time at a major pharmaceutical company and within a hospital system, and a great deal of that time in an early stage venture fund. So pretty much the earliest of the earliest investing, where it's risky but also really exciting. And my role typically is to look at where healthcare is now and figure out either where it's going or where it needs to be, or what's happening today that can take us to places that most folks haven't even envisioned yet. And so that's a really exciting job to have. What the downside of that job is that there are often lots of great ideas that are simply not investable. So if you're on the investor side, sometimes you'll see something and just say, really cool, that would be great for patients. I hope somebody sees the value and funds that thing, because as an investment opportunity, it's not a particularly sound one. But that said, there's still lots of great stuff out there, and the trick is to figure out what is the quickest, most efficient, and generally most lucrative pathway to commercialization to market. And I always like to pause when I say that word commercialization, because sometimes folks from academia sort of blanch at that word. But really, if you think of commercialization as one of the many ways that your idea, your discovery can reach patients, you will recognize that, number one, it's an important piece of the overall tools in the toolbox, in addition to publications and things like grand rounds and talks and that sort of thing. Commercialization is very often the best way, the most efficient way to get a great idea to the point where it is benefiting clinicians, patients, the public.
Okay, you guys are very efficient this morning, or this afternoon. We're going to be prepared to take questions at any point here. We've got a number of things that we're going to talk about, some questions that I've got pre-canned that'll get us into some of these deep areas. But as you can tell, you got a very knowledgeable group here in the topic. Love to have your questions at any time, and I'll be pinging you shortly on those, so start thinking about them. So I think we have, how many folks in here in this room are researchers, are investigators developing technologies? Okay, so quite a few. So when is the right time for these folks to be even thinking about whether or not they should license their technology or think about forming a startup, or when should they start the thought process related to commercialization or licensing?
I'll jump in, and I'm sure that the panel will have some great additions to this, but I'm only taking the reins of this one just because I am the university's vessel for these discussions. And
You're the intake valve.
And the intake valve, yeah. Well, I'd like to hear about your work as early as possible. I am a scientist by training, and I actually really enjoy learning about people's science in other areas too. I mean, we have stuff that really does span the gamut. I mean, we don't just have stuff related to science, actually, which is something I love about Jefferson, because we have, of course, tech. We have the design school, we have textiles, we have a pretty broad swath of things. So I want to learn what you're doing early. You're never going to be annoying me by telling me about your work. I would like you to start having conversations with me as early as possible about what the appropriate path is for your technology. If I think that a corporate partner would license your stuff, if I think a commercial functioning entity that is publicly traded and has a substantial development group, et cetera, and in-house capabilities to develop your stuff, I am going to discourage a startup every time. The role of startups in this life cycle, in my opinion, is to get us to the point where a company would want to absorb the smaller company or license the asset away from the smaller company in a way that benefits everybody who's been involved in that venture. So I mean, really talk to me early. We'll make filing decisions, we'll check out the landscape and the market, and concomitant with that, I will go start talking to corporate partners to the extent that I can reasonably with what protections we have in place and feel them out. The most common result of that is the partner says, this is really interesting, but I need a little bit more data. And it's an expensive bit of data that they need, and it's the kind of stuff the NIH and other funding agencies for academics aren't interested in. So that's where we get to the point where we say, what's our strategy here? What's our funding strategy to get to the point where this partner has interest? And that's where I frequently have startups come in around that stuff.
And I'll jump in and say that's often the point where a group like BioStrategy Partners, your host for today, will serve that critical function and be a linkage between not quite enough data and enough data to generate interest among a commercialization partner. So what BioStrategy Partners does is serve as a bridge, a broker. We go out to industry. For example, currently GSK is in the portfolio and Janssen's in the portfolio, and then there's a medical device firm as well. And what BioStrategy Partners does is say, talk with the industry partners and who say, here are our strategic interests, and then we go out to partners like Jefferson, who's part of the consortium, and say, what do you have in this space? Which of your investigators are working in this area, and can we throw them into this program we have called Germinator and see if we can't knock out some risk, make some meaningful progress on the science, and also see, do both sides have the appetite to move this thing forward? And so there are programs like BioStrategy Partners out there, but this is the one that is being represented here today in large part, but also as one that folks who are around the table on the phone, Jefferson and Penn State and Limmer, they're all part of this consortium, and so that's a great tool available to you. So shameless plug there, but there you go.
And don't most universities or many have like a bridge fund, some kind of a source for a small grant or something to get things more, move things along to the place where
That's
they
been
may
the
become
trend.
more attractive? I don't know how, it depends on the university, what the finances are, but a number of mine that I represent do have that way to try and help it get forward. But again, going back to the point, you're not going to file the patent unless you think there's commercial value to the patent. That's what patents are. They're not publications. They're not for your CV.
And they're expensive.
And they're expensive, okay? So that said, if Heather makes the decision to go forward with a patent, the first thing she's going to do is go out and look for any potential commercial partner she can find. That's what you do. That's what a licensing associate does. They
And if I may, super quick. And another thing we do is help people secure translational funding, be it Germinator, other ways. And we do really like pound the ground getting out there to talk to people. So I'll talk to the companies. The companies will say, I need some off-target talks. I need your PK. I need to know your brain penetration. What's the half-life? Stuff that NIH isn't going to fund. I'll say, okay, well, big company XYZ is interested in this. Having that information is going to really help get that translational funding, because when I can go to a potential funding partner for translational funding, frequently some sort of investment, either an evergreen fund, an investment of some sort, and say, look, big company XYZ wants to see this work. It'll cost us $500,000. That's going to be much more interesting to them than somebody showing up and saying, I think somebody would be interested if I had this data.
And I'll add that investigators help out yourself and your technology transfer officers by having those conversations when they're available to you. When you go to conferences, industry meetings, and you bump into these folks from industry, very often they're going to be more than happy to share have a discussion with you about your technology, keeping in mind that there's confidentiality issues. You need to be apprised of that, but understand that most of the folks at those kind of contexts are themselves scientists by training. They're really excited about the science, and they're often excited to share what they know and to give you some signal about whether or not there might be interest on behalf of their company in your technology. So don't leave it all to, they got a lot of work to do, right? Take some ownership of that process.
So Heather, you're going to be sorry you made that "who needs it" comment, because I'm going to keep circling back to that because I really enjoy that. So I'm going to take us on a little detour for just a second because I think it's important. And this whole idea of customer discovery, if I'm a person creating a diagnostic product, is it important for me to have talked to a physician that might use that might make a decision, a clinical decision based upon my diagnostic, or somebody that's going to prescribe a therapeutic? Is it important for me to get out there as an investigator and to really understand my world, whether it's somebody that's going to pay for it or prove it or use it? Is that part of the process in getting these things forward?
No, just kidding. Yeah, yes.
And in conclusion,
There are so many working parts to Kevin. I mean, I think it's a great question because I think we need to unpack what is a customer, what is an end user, who might actually be the partner company in the future, who could also be an acquirer. And also in the realm of diagnostics, what's your reimbursement code? Does one exist? How do surgeons favor using your device under that reimbursement code over what they're currently doing? Will it come out in their favor? So who's on the hook for the payment? Sometimes it's not the actual person who will benefit from the treatment. It might be the insurer. It might be a company that saves money by practicing your techniques or adopting your device, but it's helping a third party. So there are so many working parts, and it's always awesome when we work with a team with clinicians, which is one of the things I love about Jefferson. A lot of our stuff is developed by teams of designers, teams of students, and teams of clinicians and people who are truly seeing patients, who understand that they have to understand the reimbursement structure for what they're doing, that they have to understand the workflow of a busy surgeon, and not just that one surgeon, because surgeons are not all one kind of person. So it's super important to not live in a bubble, to not presume that even just because you as an anesthesiologist really want this, even if that's the case, get outside of your department of anesthesiology, go to other departments of anesthesiology and say, does this rationally work with your workflow? For devices, the reimbursement structure is so critical too. Not just that, but also, does it work with the clinician's workflow? Will the clinician be able to do anything with the information you're providing? Too. I mean, for many diseases, unfortunately, we're not to the point where there's meaningful intervention for some of the diseases that are scourges of humankind. Right now, neurodegenerative diseases in particular, I think we're kind of on the cusp of getting there, but there are some diseases where knowing you have it earlier may indeed quite be more tragic, and there's not going to be a huge inducement to payers to support that until there's a way to intervene meaningfully. Although with stuff like that, frequently there's people running clinical trials who may well be very interested in getting your diagnostic to triage people through their trials more efficiently. That's my thoughts on that.
Great answer. I hope you got an idea of the many dimensions that there are in understanding where you fit in the world. I remember not that long ago having a pharmaceutical company tell me, well, that idea is great in these countries, but in these countries they hate that and they'll never use it. And just the international landscape has become so important to most companies and so complex that even those dimensions, add layers of complexity to everything we're doing, not to mention cost.
But also now with the Supremes getting involved in patent law and their destruction under 101 of diagnostic method claims and methods of diagnosing using the myriad BRCA1 mutation, for example, that's another decision point for you. Is it even patentable? I mean, it will be patentable in Europe. They haven't gotten on the bandwagon yet, but the Canadians seem to be moving that way.
And if you do get a patent under that paradigm, how enforceable is it? Number one.
That's right.
And how easy would it be for somebody to go around? I mean, I have gotten stuff through under the new Myriad Mayo, Prometheus,
I have too.
quagmire, but it was so limited to the exact FAM labels and stuff that was used that it would have been easy enough for somebody to unfortunately, which it was heroic. We tried really hard. I mean, at the time we were like, yes, we got something through under this, but in the end, is it worth it? Is it worth the investment for what you're going to get right now?
So Michelle, put your investor hat on for a second. So when you look at the intellectual property pieces here and some of this customer discovery, how important is that when an investigator or a company shows up to you and wants your money? How important are those materials to have in hand?
I would say critical. There's almost no life sciences, healthcare investor who will move forward without some assurance of protection because it takes so long. We're talking 8-10 years oftentimes to bring a healthcare technology to the marketplace. So without the promise of intellectual property protection, it's very hard for an investor to imagine how they're going to see a return on that investment. And we talk about, in this space, about needing to be patient capital, but you also need to be aware that there's typically a huge investment in a healthcare technology. So the payoff needs to be, we need as much assurance that there's going to be some payoff at the end as possible. So if there's no protection or reasonable protection at the beginning, it's really hard to pull the trigger on investment, no matter how exciting the idea is. Yeah.
Sure.
But at the same time, you have to balance the life of the patent. And if you get the patent too early before it starts being able to be used, you're just shortening the life of potential profit at the end. And I'm wondering how you guys sort of strike that balance. Because obviously, to get someone interested in commercializing it, you have to show patentability. At the same time, you didn't want to get it too early and the clock started ticking and now you've lost several years on the patent before a business opportunity gets funded.
If it's a therapeutic, though, you do have the patent term extension process. So if you are delayed because you're going through FDA regulatory approval, you can get that time back. So, there is
Up to 5 years.
Up to 5 years. So there is a way to recoup some of that time that's lost.
So let me interrupt for a second. I was finding out our people attending online can't hear the question, so I'm just going to repeat the questions, hopefully briefly. So basically, when is it too early to patent, as opposed to too late? You were much more eloquent in the way you described the problem, but I just wanted to make sure we had some element of the question that the audience could hear.
So I think the answer was excellent. Relatively underused, I think, the patent term extension for regulatory delays. So if you're held up, there's nuts and bolts to it. There's requirements, but I always tell my therapeutic companies about it when they're calculating and forecasting. But another thing is, not only do I not need to tell somebody the structure of my therapeutic for early discussions about interest, but I will not tell somebody the structure of my therapeutic in early discussions. We have to be getting pretty advanced in discussions about therapeutics for me to reveal a structure. Therefore, everything leading up to that point is, this is, can be oblique to a sense. I mean, if I have a target that's well modeled, and I have to tell you how I'm binding to it, then you could lock a couple chemists in a room and they'll come up with something that might even be better than what we have. But to a sense, I think that there's a coyness you can employ in the beginning to have tentative discussions without blowing patentability. And when it does get time to talk about structures, I mean, I have hired third-party medicinal chemists to act as the assessors of the actual chemical compounds that we're looking at and give us reports rather than actually turn over the structures to companies. I mean, I can say, oh, it's easy two-step synthesis, it's this many kilodaltons. I can, there's a lot of stuff I can reveal about something without telling you too much. But that said, we're an academic research institution, so students are graduating, theses are publishing, we have to fund this work. We're kind of a sieve. So that's like the balance.
Well, the question you asked, though, is a reminder that you should always be going through as an academic center your TTO, but if you are going to form a startup, to always pursue hiring the absolute best intellectual property attorneys that you can find. They will help you think through a longer term strategy so that as the product matures or as your target patient, for example, might evolve, they can help you think through that strategy and imagine the possibilities before you have to make those fundamental decisions.
Sure.
So, question just along the topic of FDA regulated therapeutics, putting the intellectual property aside, I believe there's an exclusivity also
Yeah,
available.
there's the 271 safe harbor from infringement. So if you are working on and generating data that is going to be used for an FDA submission, then you cannot be sued for infringement, provided you have the right data. There have been cases where folks alleged 271E safe harbor, and the facts revealed that, no, indeed, they were not entitled, and then it hit the fan with litigation, okay? So.
And then what about for market exclusivity?
Are you talking about rare disease?
Yeah, I guess I'm asking the question, when does that apply, and how is that coordinated alongside the...
So the question being in addition to FDA approval and patent protection, do you get additional marketing exclusivity beyond the patent rights?
I think it's really regulated by your patent term, okay? Market exclusivity is your monopoly, all right?
Well, there are some rare disease
Right.
exceptions. But
But-
I think the patent, having a patent in hand is going to be your strongest. And then if you can go under the safe harbor if you're ramping up to kind of test something. So,
Yeah.
do you guys know of any additional, Michelle?
Except for rare diseases and orphan diseases.
Right.
Yeah, I can't.
Yeah, we
pediatric, yeah.
helped CHOP with the Rototech patent term extension, and that's in America, it's called patent term extension, and in Europe, it's called SPC, Supplementary Protection Certificates, and this is something you should keep an eye on, because it was a very big company who was funding this, and when we could go for the SPC in certain countries in Europe, they're like, oh, we don't want that, and we're like, yeah, but we do. So you have to watch and make sure where you can obtain this kind of extra protection, you want to make sure you get it.
So we talked a little bit about startup versus license, but really let's dig into the startup for just a second. Heather, you made a comment earlier about startup really being a vehicle to get to the next level. Let's dig into that a little bit more and talk about, when should somebody be considering a startup that is a vehicle to another level, or should they really just jump out of their day job and start a company? And how do you view those things? And that's for the entire panel.
Well, don't probably quit your day job. I would say don't quit your day job. I would recommend a startup when there's a bona fide end partner interest in your technology, but there's something they need to see between now and then, where funding will have to become your company will have to become a vessel for funding to get that work done. If a company will license your technology outright, ultimately would be the university's decision. Although we do, work very closely with our PIs to make sure that our primary investigators, clinicians, et cetera, to make sure that we're making decisions that work for everybody. if a company is at the table, we're gonna probably license it to the company, and we're gonna put some protections in there to make sure, we're not inadvertently getting fleeced. And if a company is interested, but it's wow, this looks great, we're super interested in this area, come back when you have these 5 things, then that's when we'll talk about a startup. The reason I say don't quit your day job is our scientists are excellent at what they do. I mean, the reason they have something a company is interested in is because they are premier in their field. The company's buying in on their science, they're buying in on their clinical expertise, and they're buying in on the fact that this scientist genuinely understands the models they're using and how groundbreaking what they're doing is. Now you need a business person, because all of that only gets you so far. All of that is still really focused on science. You need a business person for the levity of the actual practicality of taking something to market, which is absolutely 100% different than the scientific side of proving something out in nearly every way. And you have to work well together, and you have to both respect the other person's point of view about what's important.
That's a really excellent point. In 20 odd years, and I'm sure Kevin will echo this, we've seen maybe only a handful of folks who really did it well and also really thrived in that role. There's a good chance, right, that you're where you are because you not only are bright and good at your job, but you also enjoy going to work every day. And there are some number of academicians who have made the leap and found that it was really not for them. So it's not a decision to be taken lightly, and not there aren't a lot of success stories that I personally could speak to. So.
Right. Sadly, 90% plus of all startups will fail. So you have to keep that in your mind if you're going to make that decision. And you really have to have high confidence in this startup material that you're pursuing, and identify, as you just said, who your downstream partners are, and maybe even put a sort of a timeline. We're going to try this for so long with this many dollars, and then if we don't get there, that's when they fold. And in my practice, I think I've seen maybe 2 startups come to fruition and get purchased in 23 years of practice.
Yeah, I think I've had about 3 that ultimately were quite successful, one way or another. And
Right.
This has all been great points. I would just add 2 things. One is be prepared for your IP. Be prepared for your IP expenses and have a plan for your IP, and have your plan for your IP be based on discussions with patent attorneys and business people. Because some countries won't reimburse for your kind of cure for your disease. Some countries will just take your patent fees, and it won't be worth the paper it's written on to get a patent there. But make sure you have at least $500,000, I'd say, in the bank for your patents from the outset, and that's conservative. Or have a plan with your potential investors that for every amount they put in, some percent of it is able to go to IP. If you don't have strong IP, that's dangerous. Yeah.
Great points. I have about 80 that just came out of those 2 comments. So probably the important ones here. We talked about customer discovery, the importance of getting out there and learning about where you fit in the world. The reason why that's so important is you all started with your research and your innovation with it being a hypothesis, right? And your job was to prove or disprove that hypothesis. Every one of those things that you think about the commercial aspects of what you're doing, that the FDA will approve it this way, that a customer will buy it because of this, that people will pay this much money for it, that venture firms will raise it, those are all hypotheses. And they all need to be tested using the techniques that are available. And getting somebody as a partner that has been through that and understands how to build those tests and those hypotheses into facts is very important. And I believe that today's odds that I use with my MBA class are out of 100 companies, 1 will get venture funding. And out of all the venture funded companies, 6% will be the successes of those venture companies. So if you add those together, you're talking about 6 out of 10,000 organizations being successful. So the odds are long. So you really need to have excellence around you in all of the dimensions of developing the technology into a business and moving it forward. So we can't stress enough, I think the entire panel is consistent here, that there's a lot to building a business out of these things. And one other story that I want to talk about, and Michelle brought the idea to mind here, is when I was working with a pharmaceutical company on a companion diagnostic product to go to market with, When we sat around in their neuro meetings, not once did science or mechanism of action come up with the scientists in that room. They were all talking about, how do we define a trial, in this case for Alzheimer's? Do we go after moderate stage disease or do we go after early stage disease? And why? Can we prove to the FDA that it's effective? How expensive is that trial? How can we recruit these patients? How can we identify these patients? Those are the factors that are talked about within those rooms. And you have to be prepared for those discussions, because once you get past the scientists, it's those people that'll be asking you the questions as well. So,
Can we
Sure.
start from the end? So, for example, if I have an intrasite-related diagnostic or therapy, then I send an email to the chairman of probably 10 or 12 different liver and GI departments and say, please circulate this. I have an idea to come up with this product. Would there be enough demand? Question B, if not, then suggest the 3 most problematic issues that your physicians face every day. And then try to finding a method is easier than finding a market. So this way we can also say, hey, I have checked with 12 departments and 62 physicians. We can use that as a pre-market analysis. That way we can also to some extent satisfy the ever-present question of how do I get my money back by the angels and the nieces.
Oh, yeah, start at the end. If those people will answer you, ultimately you're just saving me time sending them the same email. But yes, no, yeah, always start at the end, and that is one of Jefferson's models, which is actually talking to people about problems before we come up with
Yes, so
solutions.
as a physician, if he or she is having a problem, it's in their interest, they better tell, this is the problem I have, this is what I'd like to have, and then prove the answer.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's what frequently, is kind of missing when a scientist approaches with something that they've created because they're working deep in their field and realized a need. You have to get out there, you have to talk to people, and you have to be solving a real problem.
Because we get so involved in I have this experiment, it went so well, I can modify it and give an applied value without wondering whether there's a demand. So instead of that, try to fit the science to it.
Yeah, there's other working parts of that too, which is there's certainly places where there is demand, but that doesn't mean that that you could truly actually ever recoup the cost of the effort. And there's places where there's no demand and somehow people made money, like ringtones and fonts, As far as I know, nobody was like, I wish my phone would play this obnoxious song when I'm getting a call. But somehow somebody created it, and I guess the driver there was bored.
The other issue when you're going for method claims is the ability to police that method, all right? The one reason you get your patent is so that you can identify your infringers and go after them. And some methods have all of the reagents available off the shelf from Sigma or Invitrogen or the like, and invariably you would publish on that diagnostic. You would tell the world how wonderful it was. And the problem is then somebody, Joe Q physician, might be infringing your patent, but you would never know.
Yeah.
And so those are other considerations you want to take into account when you decide to go forward with a method patent.
So if you patent the product, then no matter what pathway it took, they cannot make the same.
I always say go for the thing. If you can get the thing, go for the thing. The method claims are great to have as well as a companion patent, and often now, if you get claims to the product, the patent office will allow you to rejoin claims to the method of use of the product. So you get it all in one nice little package. But I always tell my clients, if we can have the thing, I would rather the thing. Now, the reason why Taq polymerase method was so successful was because the infringers could be tracked by their purchases of the Taq. Okay? So if there is something in your method that's unique, then that's another consideration to be making.
Yeah, there's a couple thoughts that I weigh when we're to the point where we could only get a method of use claim, like for a new use for a therapeutic that's already available. Off patent. One would be how would we enforce it? And the other one would be, what would be the political ramifications of enforcing it? Who would be the target? Who would be the infringers? Frequently, it's actually clinicians, because the way that the claims will read is a method of treating a disease using, this disease using this therapeutic. The person who's actually doing that is frequently a clinician using something off-label. And if they're going to do that, are we going to take up the PR storm of kicking in their doors to enjoin them from saving patients' lives as a nonprofit academic research institution hospital system? The answer is almost always no. A few people have made that decision. BRCA1/2 gene case was one of those, instances. Hank Kazakian
And look where that got us.
Yeah, Hank Kazakian at Penn was literally enjoined from treating patients or testing patients to see if they had the BRCA1/2 mutation and then providing them with prophylactic mastectomies. It was a PR nightmare. I think somebody came after June for a component of his car system that they did, in fact, owned. They stopped children dying of cancer from getting treatment. Like, literally in there. So the methods aren't great. I'd rather have the thing, and that means the thing is new, and that means you don't have all of this other baggage coming with it. But you can also do unique formulations of existing things, too. So that is, like, something I do, like composition of matter claims around formulation.
So I want to make one comment on your question, because you excited me that you were willing to do this customer discovery and to look at the world out there and how you fit into it. But there were a couple of questions you asked that I spent an entire semester telling students never ask. Never ask people if they like your product. Try never to ask yes and no questions. What you always want to do when you're doing customer discovery is cue up the other person to talk and to keep talking. How does the process work within your institution? Let them talk about it. What are the problems that you have with that process? What are the opportunities for somebody to come in here to provide you open-ended questions that do a lot of talking. I can tell you a very sad story about $60 million I raised to take a diagnostic product to market, all based on market research that said if you had a diagnostic product that could increase efficacy and lower toxicity of cancer therapeutics, would you use it? It was easy to say yes to. 100% of people said yes. How many bought it? 0. Not a one ever bought it. And there are reasons why, but easy questions give you misinformation. So you need that open-ended discussion, because you really learn a lot. And the follow-up questions you get an opportunity to ask on that are very valuable.
Yeah, I always end it with that I'm looking for feedback. Like I want feedback. I'd like to know when they might, what might they want to see, when might they be interested, but yeah.
And you might torture them by not telling them what you're doing in the first meeting, but that's great. That gives you another opportunity to come back later and ask.
Buy them lunch.
So again, with the startups, so being a stepping stone to another, what role does funding play in that? Is that because that you're looking for SBIR, STTR, private funding? How much of the funding part is solved by getting into the startup part?
Actually, you're reminding me that I wanted to add this on before and I forgot. If nobody's interested, don't do a startup. If you can't find a business person who's interested in your idea and partnering with you, if you cannot find a company that's like, yeah, I'd be interested to see, this and that, which kind of, I guess, might run an affront to your thing of don't, ask them when, if they, yes or no, if they're interested. But I do kind of say, like, well, when might you? When might you be interested in something like this? What might I be able to show you that would great interest? Then I iteratively go back and build from that. If everybody's like, no, frequently the reasons are no, because somebody tried it and it was an epic failure. For a long time, that was the gene therapy story, right? Mm-hmm. Nobody would touch it because there was really bad stuff that happened there, and it was just a bad spot. We're coming back up from that. That was a business decision. They were probably right. Somebody already tried that pathway and it was tragic. Usually you should know that because it's your scholarship, but sometimes you don't, et cetera. Or, there's no patents, there's no reimbursements, those patients, could never afford it, the hospitals wouldn't, et cetera. So understand that great science isn't always great business. And now putting that aside, SBIRs, STTRs are great. Investors love to see it. It's non-dilutive funding. That's fantastic. But I do think you have to have your story tight both for your investors and even to go get SBIRs and STTRs, everybody's going to want to know what's your end game, you know, and is it a cogent story for your end game? And number two, approaching one of those two with the other one in hand. You know, it is a chicken egg thing, but going for an SBIR and saying like, look, this venture fund will match. This venture fund will come in if I get to this point and get a letter of commitment. I'm really big, non-binding letters of interest, etc. Get it written, not binding. Just say we looked at it. Yeah, we're excited. This is an area we're in. We have these capabilities. We'll, you know, we might invest at this point. Those can iteratively feed into one another. And okay, I'll turn it over to you guys.
No, I think your point is well taken. You know, the best, your best innovators will find the money, you know, because folks are interested. The money follows the interest. And as you just said, if there is no interest, it's too much money to go down this road, either a startup or even just filing the patents. So, and you as the investigators will know who your people are, you know, who to go out and approach, as would Heather.
The diagnostics, the molecular-based diagnostics post-Myriad Mayo, this is one of the spaces where I'm hitting this road with people who are like, but it's great, but it solves this huge problem. And I'm like, it's not patentable anymore.
Right.
And they're like, no. No, well, look at this patent somebody just got. And I'm like, you know, they got it, but it's not a good patent. And this has been a lurch.
And the Sequenom decision, the Sequenom versus Arioso, where they
That was devastating.
it's devastating. It's a miscarriage
I know
of
the guys that
justice.
funded that.
It's a miscarriage of justice. These people found circulating paternal DNA in the female and were able to do a diagnosis.
For Down syndrome.
For Down
Huge
syndrome, and because of the Supremes, and they're getting involved in natural products, they've really, they're souring investment in these kinds of diagnostics,
Right.
which is criminal. It
People
really
were
is.
previously doing amniocentesis to run this test, so invasive, so traumatic for the mother. And this team found that there's circulating biomarkers for certain kinds of trisomy. And everybody thought, okay,
This is gonna be the one.
This is going to be the one where the Supreme Court's like, that's kind of like what we were talking about. Like you figured out like a totally new way to do something that was already being done using a molecular-based diagnostic. And they shot it down, and everybody's like, just collective exhale deflation. Nobody really thought they really were going to take it.
It's still shocking, okay? I hear there's an appeal. Something's going on, so cross fingers. Yes, a question in the back.
After such intense conversation, I feel a little sheepish asking my pure business question.
Go ahead.
So it's clearly more nuanced than this, and we've sort of been touching on this the entire time. But business and marketing plan prior to asking about patent, or asking about patent, then develop business and marketing.
You have to have a patent strategy.
I
You
think
have to have a patent
I agree with Heather. If your business plan and every other thing is based on an unpatentable invention, you probably don't have a good plan, okay? So, yeah, first you have to assess the novelty, non-obviousness, and utility of your idea. And once you do that, then you think you're on the road, then you start thinking about your business plan.
There's backups, trade secret, software, copyright.
Copyright.
Yeah.
Trademark even
Trademark.
sometimes can help.
Yeah, Gatorade.
I guess I was approaching it from a sense like, yeah, obviously, you know, you look someone into your patent, you feel like maybe
You've upset some people.
maybe you feel like you can tweak it to a degree and maybe get it back another way. Because a lot of what we were talking about is, you know, a lot of people come to you, okay, this is cool, it solves a need, we'll never make any money on it. You know what I mean? It also sort of defeats the purpose of even going for the patent. It's like, I understand it's like a delicate balance here, and it does make sense. So obviously we need to make sure we can patent something prior to it. This incentivizes innovation.
Yeah. And so the question for everybody online is, when's the right time in the business plan forecasting life cycle to think about IP? And I do think it is iterative, though. I mean, I will add, you know, your business plan is going to be dependent on your IP. How much is it going to cost? How practical will it be? How enforceable will it be? What countries do you need it in? That goes back to how much will it cost? But then later, most big companies will like for you to have a picket fence of IP around your stuff. And so you do want to revisit later and say, what have we done in the reduction to practice of this idea that might also be patentable? That is actually, that does bring us to an important point that I'm not sure was really your point, but which is kind of like, if something didn't work, later on, from a patent standpoint, that can be really exciting information for filing a new patent. So if you found out one formulation, one dose is the wrong dose when you're in trials, et cetera, file another patent.
Exactly. It can be novel now. You've done something, and failure of others to succeed is an indicia of non-obviousness, so you can get away with that.
It wouldn't hurt to have some conversations, though, with business people or investors, or even to look at some of the public documents that are available in annual reports of the similar type of companies. Right now, you heard some of the challenges on the front end of molecular diagnostics, while at the same time, it could be $200 or $300 million in studies to convince payers to pay for those molecular diagnostic tests. If you look at Cologuard, which is very popular, you see it on television, it's $300 million of clinical studies to get that reimbursed. So that makes those economics very important. So from a business perspective, yeah, maybe you want to understand the generic patent law, but before you proceed and try to spend a lot of money patenting it, you better find out if all the levers are going to work and you can make a profit or create a business out of it.
Yeah, that's a good point. It is quite iterative, really. Yeah.
It's much easier to say, oh, look, $2 billion market for a therapeutic, right? And I can, patent the compound. That can be a quick check of the box. Question in the front?
So, speaking of the patenting process, we have seen no way to advise the patent office on which art unit to study a new application, even though it's pretty clear to us as professors, well, this is the right art unit for my idea. They will just sort of randomize which art unit gets your application, and I have felt helpless about that. Is there any way to advise the patent office of which art unit has the right expertise?
The art units are assigned based on how you've drafted your claims, okay? I typically work in 1600 and 1700, but if it's a device, it's like 2300, and computers is yet another art unit. But really, it is guided by how your claims are written, whether you get in the chemical art unit, the plant ag art unit, or the biotech, or the hard chemistry. So I would wonder what your claims are looking like, because I almost always get put in the same art unit.
Well, in this particular case, we had a molecular radiodiagnostic that should have gone to antisense, and it went to some viral gene therapy art unit.
Okay.
No clue.
Did you have a viral target?
No.
I've not experienced that before, okay? But they should, but nonetheless, you should have gotten a fair examination. Is it your point that one art unit did not examine your case as fairly as you thought another art unit might?
They were clueless. They just had no idea what the issue was.
Is
Well-
this one we have prosecution right now?
We gave up on it.
Okay, does it predate me?
Yes.
Okay, because it didn't sound familiar. It didn't sound familiar, and I was like, this is really an interesting story that's playing out.
So, your
But just back to, I'm curious, when you were prosecuting this case, did you get declarants? Did you get, do oral interviews? What did you do?
we did a over the phone conference.
Uh-huh.
We did do one in-person interview down there, as well as another one over the phone. And the original examiner simply dug in the heels on not understanding what in the world this synthetic chemistry molecular diagnostic was all about.
For everybody listening in, we're getting a pretty in-depth question about
Yeah,
different
sorry.
examination
Yeah,
units in the patent office.
Right.
With NIH, with a grant application, one can tell them, these are the most relevant expert committees to examine my application. With the patent office, I wonder, is there any route to?
No, you cannot select. No, you
The
cannot.
point
But you
is
could
that
appeal a wrong
You could
decision.
appeal a wrong decision if
it
it,
goes back to the same unit.
It's expensive.
no. If you appeal, it's going to go to a panel of 3 appellate judges. So you will, and your examiner's not even present,
Yeah.
okay? And you're right, it is about, the appeal brief runs you between 4 and 6 or 8,000. It depends again on subject matter. And then the examiner may answer, and then you may have to reply to that answer. So, and then you have to schedule your oral hearing, and at that time, 2 years have passed, and again, we're losing term.
So Kate, I'm going to do a commercial for you.
Oh, thank you.
Over numerous startups, probably 24, I probably dealt with 100 attorneys. Very often I would go into these companies, I was doing turnarounds in particular, and I'd have to slash patent costs because inappropriate things were done. The value of a good patent attorney cannot be understated, you overstated. You really need to ignore the hourly rate. In fact, the more they're charging you, probably the better they are.
Not always.
But do not skimp in that area, because you get what you pay for. I've only dealt out of those 100 with 2 good attorneys. So they're rare.
I mean,
Find them.
and interview people. I mean, well, so I will add this. You know, the university is going to choose. It's not actually to the discretion of the individual people to choose who we choose. That said, I mean, if there's a company, we'll definitely 100% work with them, especially if they're footing the bill. But go out and talk to people. And there are analytics you can run on, you know, what kind of claims does this firm normally get allowed? You know, what kind of companies they work in. So there are certain kinds of software companies that actually their whole thing is pulling out software about like the quality of a firm's prosecution. But I will add, there's a life cycle kind of element to it though, because what you see coming through as allowed probably started 5 years ago. And that doesn't mean that the same people are involved.
The other thing you can do is, if you find an attorney you might be interested in, you can go to the USPTO website and do LREP search. So if you do that, LREP Rigaut, for me, you'll see I've prosecuted over 200 patents to issuance. And so then you can see where I was working, what my claims look like, and get an idea. Like, some people will hold themselves out to be a patent attorney. You LREP them and they have 2 patents.
Yeah.
The one thing about, we're an intellectual property boutique, so all we do is intellectual property. So we don't have the stressors of a general practice firm where we have to have large overhead. We're only 9 attorneys. You know, and you benefit from using a firm that only does patent work, because the patent process is just somewhat bizarre. There are times where a paper will come across your desk and you're, what in the world is this? And unless you have real deep experience, you won't be able to get the job done to the best advantage of your desires. You know, to get the best claims you can get, you really need people who do this job day in and day out and don't just dabble.
Yeah.
Question about patentability, with a specific reason. Some time ago, I found that one of the European pharma companies tried to get another fresh patent in India for a certain drug, therapeutic. I think the judge was a chemist by himself, or I don't know what to do.
I doubt that, but that would be great.
So he said this is a very small add-on to the parent structure, and so I have to consider this as a derivative, and therefore you cannot get another 12 or 15-year patent on it. So having that as a backdrop, if I have a variant of the same enzyme, 2 different variants, in one of those I'm able to drastically decrease the energy of activation barrier. And then the other one, either I can increase the turnover rate or I can decrease the probability of inhibition by competitive inhibitor. So I have 2 different products essentially. Could they be patented, or would the patent holder of the enzyme, previous version of the enzyme itself, say he cannot patent this? Because when I looked at some of the patents, I'm an artist, there are claims at the end of the patent for which there is no data in the main patent.
This is the bane of many my inventors' existence.
Let me interrupt for just a second. Again, we're going into a detailed question on patenting.
Yeah, it's about derivatives.
I'm
of
getting texts on,
compounds.
what are you guys talking
Yeah.
about?
So the question's about the patentability around derivatives of therapeutics and biologics.
So if we have a known enzyme, so we have the enzyme, we have the sequence of the enzyme, we might even know the 3D structure of that enzyme. Are your derivatives different in any way? Have you made a mutation to decrease the activation? Okay. When you make a mutation, you can have a new composition of matter. That is one place where even our prohibition right now on natural products, if you have a recombinantly produced product where you've changed amino acids and now imparted a new feature to that enzyme, rendering it sounds like superior over the original version, then yes, you can still get patent protection on that.
Even a point mutation would suffice?
If the point mutation would not be obvious to the skilled artisan, and again, I'm assuming you have the three-dimensional structure, you know where the nook or the cranny or the, you know what I'm trying to say, is the active site, and we know there's 4 amino acids there, and everybody knows that, and you've changed like an alanine to a proline, and you've done something, you might have an issue with that. That there will be.
Change its function to some meaningful way.
In an unexpected way.
But in an unexpected way. So if you're changing around the active site, I would imagine there's other literature on this enzyme where folks have done things to the active site. So it will really be a case-specific issue, and we'd have to assess the prior art, who's done what to that enzyme, to that active site, and then you'd make a decision. But if it was a surprising, unexpected, superior result, then typically that will get you some traction at the patent office.
And this is another one where failure can kind of, people always think in science failures are kind of like, not highly regarded, but in patent law they can be kind of exciting, because if somebody tried a mutation similar to yours and the protein fell apart, it was degraded, it no longer bound in a meaningful way, whatever, you became ubiquitinated, whatever. I'm just kind of going out on a jaunt. But your mutation actually maintains the relevant structure, or it's, or allosterically, enhances binding. That kind of stuff, those failures can actually be meaningful for you when you go into prosecution and say, oh yeah, like you just turned a proline into a valine, and we know this is the binding site or the active site. This is obvious, but you can say, oh no, other researchers tried this and it didn't work, or I tried it in 5 different places, it didn't work. So but it is a case by case.
Yeah, it's case specific.
Just a real quick follow-up question. So in a circumstance like that, like when is it important to consider freedom to operate?
Now, at that stage, it's not a freedom to operate, it's a patentability opinion. Oftentimes, I'll be asked, can you please take a look at the patent database, the public literature, PubMed, and tell me where we stand on this? And oftentimes, I can find 102 art. There's no novelty here.
Well, I think that he said somebody owns the enzyme here, which this creates a whole myriad. But if somebody owns a compound and you add a radio label to it, you tritiate it, etc., then you will need a license.
That's right.
From that person to use your modified version of their compound, irrespective of the fact that you might be able to get a patent. Concomitantly, they cannot use your improvement unless they have a license from you.
Yeah, but in that case, though, if the claims in the parent case, let's assume there's a patent, don't cover or somehow exclude this new innovation, then you don't have to go to them.
Right.
But if you did take their stuff and tritiate it or add a label or then you definitely need an FDO.
Okay, I'm going to pull us back into the development and commercialization pathway out of the patenting. We don't want to scare anybody off today.
Sorry.
That's all right. I'm going to put a question out to all 3 of you. Can you weave for us what a success story looks like? One that started early on, came out of the lab, and what did that look like? What does this success look like here? Let's leave everybody with a good vision of what's possible. Who wants to start?
We worked with ViraPharma, which was a small chemical startup out in Malvern, out in the burbs. And we started with them. They had some compounds that looked promising for hepatitis C virus and a couple of other viruses. And Pat Hagen, my retired partner, who I miss, who left us 6 months ago to go live. Anyway, he took out the patents for ViraPharma, and they did very successfully. They had clinical trials, all was going well, and they got acquired by Shire, which is exactly how you want these things to go. You want to spin it out, you want to get things going, and they were from a university, some of the investigators were from a university down in DC, and they got together, 5 of them. It was like 5 virologists got together and made up Virapharma, and they were chemists as well, and they made their molecules, and they had efficacy, they had people using them, and then they got sold to Shire. And that's really the best outcome for your startup. You know, you start it up, and somebody with big dollars says it looks good, and, you know, then you recoup your money.
But you do have to stay with it because they had Provisional, that was the cure for the common cold that failed.
Yeah.
It failed because it interfered with birth control. And
Yeah, that's, oh, the tension.
I'll take a cold.
so you have to think that big picture.
Right, but they didn't go out of business, you know, that's right, that's right, yeah.
Thank
So,
you for that.
One of my current favorites is technology that actually it comes out of Penn State. And these folks, what they have is a new use, a new application, and a new formulation for naloxone, which most of you know as the drug that can save folks who are threatened with a death by overdose. So this compound, these researchers have been looking at a lot of different other applications of this drug, and this is one that that the greenhouse, the life sciences greenhouse, my former employer, Kevin's former employer, has out licensed, and it looks like it could be a great win for everybody, right? So there's a compound out there, lots of good safety data on it. It could be, as far as life science investments go, a relatively quick flip. So there's lots of promise there, and that's one that I'm particularly excited about right now. And what one of the things that's interesting about it is it hits on 2 things, right? It's a repurposed compound, but a novel formulation, and probably also there'll be some methods around that. So it's a thing and it's a method.
And there's a great need.
And there's a great need, absolutely.
And let's not forget, and 2 good management people attached to it.
Yes, exactly. I'm
right?
remiss in saying
So-
that, yeah.
So
part
there's a
of-
balance to that
Yes.
whole opportunity.
That's a really good point, yep.
So I'm worried that if I pick one out, people will feel left out.
You have political considerations.
And then I'm also sitting here thinking, oh, was that public information? So I will just say that in my experience, the most successful companies have 2 things, 3. 3 things. One is a great scientist, well regarded in their field. Usually not a new scientist that's, new and doesn't have a lot of publications, isn't considered an opinion leader in their field. They usually have an excellent business person, a seasoned business person, somebody who has been doing the business of science for a long time, not necessarily a business person who is wealthy and tied in
Ran
other
a pizza
fields.
stand.
Right, and this does happen. There are, some, I'll round them up to being like kind of tycoon investors that, but usually the smartest of those hire the business people I'm referring to, which are the people who have been there, done that. And then I would say that the third thing is that they have an IP plan, that they have a plan for where they're going to file, why they're going to file there, and that ties in, of course, to the reimbursement. And how it's going to be funded over the first, if I were to ever start a company, I would assume that I would have to support the patents out for 5 years, and I would not form the company until I had my plan and my finances for that in hand or committed by investors in writing. So I think those are, for me, the elements. But, we've been a part of some fantastic companies, and, others, they didn't make it, and often I'd say they didn't make it not for reasons that had anything to do with the technology. Most of the companies that I know that didn't make it, it was other things, not that the technology didn't necessarily work. Usually the companies don't get to that point of being formed if the technology doesn't work. So, yeah.
Yeah, we had an investigator, Michelle, I'm going to try to really anonymize this, but made his money in real estate and restaurants and the like, but mom died of a particular disease, and he has now put 15 years of his life into this business, and it shouldn't go anywhere. It should never have been invested in. But you had somebody that was attracted by the disease state and somebody who had the money to invest it, and the 2 together have been an absolute failure because of that.
May I ask one more question?
I had a question behind you first.
Let me paint a brief scenario and get comments from any of the 4 of you on sort of like what would you recommend as the right process approach. So there's a fitness thinking about helping start a business in it. The technology has had a proof of concept level developed, but it's not developed enough. It needs a second generation version of it that would be small and convenient enough for people to wear it in regular life. So that has to happen. Also, there's been no patent process begun on it. So what would be the right order?
How do you know about it then? Remember, your people, yeah, was it under CDA?
CEA?
Confidentiality disclosure agreement? Confidential disclosure agreement?
Well, I don't know the details of how their invention works.
Oh, okay, okay.
And
As
far
Heather
I
said.
know, they've not shared
Right, okay.
details about it, so therefore it's still patentable. But that's as far as I know, because no patent attorney's been engaged to start a process yet. And they've gotten advice that includes work further on developing a second version, because how you invent that will be what you'll probably want to patent. But at the same time, investors probably want to know that something's patentable, and but also don't want to be spending money on something that you can't make into a good working unit. So you're balancing like three different things there. And if I were to jump in and try to launch this as a company, I want to see that both those things will work before I invest money and try time to get other people to invest.
This is sort of exactly what I was. This is our.
So here's a scenario asking you, what would each of you, if you have anything to say, recommend in terms of the steps of those things? Because you do have to do something first, or all of them in parallel.
Yours is a leap of faith situation, okay? Either you believe in that technology and you want to part with your dollars.
And the team.
And the team. Or you don't think they're ready yet for your money, okay? Again, this is kind of a business decision. Does the technology they describe to you, is it far enough along that you believe it's actually working? And if it is far enough along, what is it going to take to make it wearable for the common user?
But at what point do we have the patent attorneys starting to work with them to patent it? Do we have the initial conversation right up front and get their opinion? Because I assume different patent attorneys would give different advice. Maybe you would say do that first, but the attorneys that they've already talked to said do it later.
If it were me, I would meet with an attorney right away. Right away, because they're going to tell you, I'm going to guess, they're going to tell you this is a populated field. This is like, like assistive golf devices. Like, right now, this sounds like it's an area that's really, it's not my area, but I have a feeling they're going to be like, it's really populated, and you're going to want to work with them from the get-go to say, okay, it's like you want to know when you're going forward, what's out there, how are we going to make our device in a way that isn't going to be impeded. So the patent attorney doesn't need to be called because you have a patent to file. The patent attorney can be called because you need a strategy to file ultimately.
Right, you need to assess your landscape and then perhaps come up with a bell or a whistle on that device that will avoid the prior art devices.
Or copyrighted software.
Or copyrighted software. So it really should, early on, you should get somebody involved to let you know if it's a non-starter, because indeed it may be.
This might be a good place for an SBIR, though, where they could innovate with getting advice around what the technology could look like and needs to look like, and then using non-dilutive funding. You just need to create a company, but it could be a shell, and then you do the work it funds back to and so that might be a good place where the SBIR comes in. And frankly, in the SBIR setting, you would get a letter from an investor saying it meets these set of goals that we would be interested in investing. If there's some strategic partner out there and they write a letter in support saying, hey, if it does what they think it can do, we'd be interested in talking about license. So, and that would get you a good chance of getting an SBIR.
And if I may talk,
Yeah, sure, go ahead, Heather.
just one more quick thing. One other thing you might want to consider too is just a rolling provisional. Just to cover yourself with a rolling provisional. So by that I mean, talk to your attorneys, have a plan, file a provisional that's nuts and bolts, current view of the product, knowing you're probably not going to convert that provisional in a year. But if something happens and you need to, it's there. It's expensive-ish, but it can cover you if there's, a need to move forward, or the, so I do that sometimes with stuff where I think it might move forward.
Having the provisional application pending will also be more attractive to your investors.
Yeah.
So, and as Heather said, what you can do, the year comes up and you're like, oh, we're not there yet. You can either refile, add a little more bells and whistles to that provisional, and start your clock again. And you can start your clock 4 or 5 times if you need be.
As long as you don't publicly disclose, you're not giving up
Right.
that pendency of the term. And the investor should understand if when you get to that year, you're like, look, like, we're not ready to convert this patent. We've done 5 things that we aren't going to get relation back for. We think what we have now is better, and we want to keep submarining. A good investor should love that you're keeping it patent pending without moving ahead to the expensive form of prosecution on a device that's not optimal.
Right, till you're at prime time.
So we had a question, yeah, you.
Picking up on Michelle's use of the word repurpose, if, for example, we take rigorous bisphosphate carboxylate, it's a carboxylate, and it's well known, but then one of its other functions is, depending on the reaction conditions, it can also be an oxygenase, if I remember right. I'm recalling what you wrote literature. So, since the enzyme and its functions are known, but if no one has ever filed a patent for an application based on either of its 2 enzymatic properties, can patents be filed because that's the first application of the carboxylate?
Those features would be inherent to the molecule, so in the United States, you would not be able to do it because the composition is known. We have a question in the back?
Yeah, last question, please.
I guess it's not a super straightforward question, but it's something I think about all the time. Basically, how do you get sort of market validation, feedback from intended audience, users, markets, while not totally letting the cat out of the bag, and while also not asking everyone who needs to sign an NDA because they want to.
You do a generic kind of disclosure, and that's what you send out to your potential customers. You give them enough to get them excited, but not enough for them to know exactly what you have.
But if you need them to test it and to check it out,
Then you need a CDA. You can't let them touch it till you have a confidentiality agreement in place.
a lot of people just make these really complex things and spend lots of time and money, but they don't really get it in front of enough people, and then it's all just so obvious.
Right, but all's fair in love and war, and when there's money, people get funny, but not in a ha-ha way.
Yeah.
So you have to just be careful, that's all. You don't want to put your invention out to people who may nefariously, run with it, okay?
That's why we need an MTA also.
Yeah, MTAs are good if you're going to actually give them a composition or a thing.
Okay, we've reached the end of our time. I want to thank BioStrategy Partners for putting this together, our hosts here at Thomas Jefferson, and of course our panelists for doing a great job. So thank you. If you have questions, I'm sure everybody will be lingering around.